The great chamber of the Concord of ascending species stretched for miles in every direction, and its walls were made of living crystal that hummed with the thoughts of 1,000 civilizations. Ambassador Keth Voren of the Dominion stood at the center podium, his forearms crossed over his armored chest as he watched the human delegation enter through the eastern gate. "They walk like prey," whispered a crystalline elder beside him, its body pulsing with suspicious blue light. "All the more reason to watch them carefully," Keth Voren replied, his voice carrying the weight of 300 years of diplomatic experience. The humans moved through the chamber with what they probably thought was confidence. But every species in the room could see the truth hidden beneath their calm faces. They were afraid, and that, Keth Voren knew, made them dangerous. The Concord had watched humanity for 3 centuries now. Ever since their first primitive ships had stumbled beyond their home system and into the vast network of galactic civilization, every member of the Concord remembered their own species awakening into the stars. And every single one of them had followed the same pattern. First came exploration. Then came expansion. Then came the wars. It was biological law, written into the very nature of evolution itself. Any species smart enough to reach the stars was smart enough to understand that resources were limited, and survival required dominance. The Vethkai had slaughtered their way across 17 systems before the old Concord had finally stopped them. The crystalline hegemony had consumed 3 entire civilizations before they had learned to channel their hunger into more acceptable pursuits. Even the peaceful Mothari, who now tended the galaxy's greatest gardens, had once burned worlds to ash in their quest for territory. Violence was not a choice. Violence was nature. So when the human ambassador, a small woman named Dr. Yusra Okonkwo, stepped up to the speaking platform and began to talk about peace, the chamber rippled with knowing amusement. "We come not as conquerors," she said, her voice steady despite the thousands of alien eyes watching her every movement, "but as neighbors who wish to learn and share and grow alongside you." The Vethkai delegation clicked their mandibles in dry laughter. The crystalline hegemony pulsed with sardonic golden light. Even the Mothari, gentle as they were, exchanged looks that said they had heard this speech before from 100 other young species. "We understand that trust must be earned," Dr. Okonkwo continued, seemingly unaware of the mockery surrounding her. "And we are prepared to earn it through actions rather than words." Keth Voren leaned forward slightly, studying her face for any sign of the predator hiding beneath. All he saw was earnest hope, which meant she was either the greatest actress in the galaxy, or humanity was playing a game so long and so complex that even the Concord could not see its shape. After the delegation departed, the council convened in private chambers. "They are playing the long game," Keth Voren announced to the assembled representatives, "feigning weakness until they have mapped our defenses and identified our vulnerabilities." "Perhaps," said the crystalline elder, "but we have seen this strategy 1,000 times before, and it has never lasted more than a generation." "Then we wait," Keth Voren replied, "and we watch, and when the mask finally slips, we will be ready." The council voted unanimously to treat humanity with cautious suspicion. They would allow trade, but only under strict supervision. They would permit diplomatic exchanges, but every human vessel would be tracked and monitored, and most importantly, they would send an observer to live among the humans and report on their true nature. The task fell to Sirith, the youngest diplomat in the Vethkai delegation. She was brilliant and ambitious, but she was also expendable. The council selected her precisely because they expected her mission to end in her death. When the humans finally revealed their true intentions, when they dropped their mask of peace and showed the predators they truly were, Sirith would be their first victim. Her death would serve as justification for the Concord's preemptive strike. It was a cold calculation, But the Concord had not survived for 6,000 years by being sentimental. Sirith accepted the assignment without complaint. She had read the histories, and she knew what every species eventually became. The humans were no different. They could not be different. Evolution did not permit exceptions on the day she departed for Earth. Ambassador Kethvorin pulled her aside for a final word of advice. "Do not be fooled by their soft faces and their gentle words," he said, placing one of his 4 hands on her shoulder. "Behind every smile is a set of teeth waiting to bite." "I understand, Ambassador," Sirith replied, her mandibles clicking with determination. "Do you?" Kethvorin asked, his ancient eyes studying her young face. "You are Vethkai, and you know what we were before we joined the Concord. And you know that we recognized our own reflection in every species we have ever encountered." Sirith nodded, remembering the old stories of her people's violent past. "The humans will reveal themselves eventually," Kethvorin continued. "Perhaps in a moment of anger, or perhaps in a moment of fear. But the predator always emerges, and when it does, you must be ready to run or die. I will not fail the Concord," Sirith promised. Kethvorin smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "I know you will not," he said, "because failure is not in our nature." 3 days later, Sirith's ship entered Earth orbit, and she looked down at the blue and green world spinning below her. It looked peaceful from up here, but so did every world. From a distance, the monsters only revealed themselves when you got close enough to see their teeth. Sirith activated her translation implant, checked her recording devices, and prepared herself for the long deception she was about to witness. She expected to find predators wearing masks of kindness. She expected to uncover schemes of conquest hidden behind offers of friendship. She expected, ultimately, to die in service to the Concord's safety. What she did not expect was to have every single one of her assumptions shattered into a million pieces. But that is exactly what happened, because Earth was not what she thought it was, and humans were not what anyone thought they were, and the universe itself was about to learn that some rules have exceptions, even the rules written into the very nature of life itself. 6 months on Earth had shattered everything. Sirith thought she understood about the universe. She had arrived expecting monsters, and instead she had found something far more confusing. She had found kindness, not the performed kindness of diplomats trying to win favor, and not the calculated kindness of merchants trying to close a deal. This was something else entirely. This was kindness that served no purpose. Kindness that offered no benefit to the giver. Kindness that sometimes even caused harm to those who practiced it, and it was everywhere. In her first week, Sirith had witnessed a human run into a burning building to save a stranger's pet. The human had suffered severe burns across 40% of his body. And when Sirith had asked him why he had done something so foolish, he had looked at her with genuine confusion. "There was a dog in there," he had said. As if that explained everything. It explained nothing. No rational species risked death for an animal belonging to someone else. No rational species threw away its own survival for something so meaningless, and yet humans did it constantly. Earthy observed them donating blood, their own vital fluid, to people they would never meet and would never receive thanks from. She watched them volunteer in hospitals, spending hours caring for sick aliens whose species had never offered humanity anything in return. She saw them weep at news reports showing suffering on distant worlds, worlds that had no strategic value and no resources worth claiming. "This is elaborate," she reported to Ambassador Kethvorin during their weekly communication. "Their deception runs deeper than I anticipated." "Of course it does," Kethvorin replied, his image flickering slightly on the screen. "The long game requires commitment, and humans have clearly committed fully to their performance. But Ambassador, The resources they are spending on this deception are staggering. Then they must expect even greater returns when they finally strike. Kethvorin said, "Continue observing, and do not allow yourself to be fooled." Cirith ended the communication and sat alone in her quarters for a long time. She was not fooled. She could not be fooled. She was Vethkai, and her people had spent millennia learning to recognize predators hiding behind friendly faces, and yet something did not add up. The mathematics of deception required that the cost of maintaining a lie be less than the benefit of its eventual payoff, but the cost humans were paying for their supposed performance was astronomical. They were building hospitals and schools and refugee centers on worlds that would never be able to repay them. They were sending aid to species that had openly declared hostility toward humanity. They were spending their limited resources on compassion, when those same resources could have been spent on weapons and warships. No rational predator would make such a trade unless the predator was not rational, unless the predator was insane, or unless the predator was not actually a predator. Alcerith pushed that thought away and focused on her mission. She needed more evidence. She needed to find the vein of diverge cracks in the performance. She needed to catch them in a moment when they thought no one was watching. That opportunity came 3 months later. A terrorist attack on the Kepler station, a human outpost near the border of Concord space, had killed dozens and left hundreds more trapped in a damaged section of the habit. Cirith had been visiting the station as part of her observation duties, and she had found herself caught in the alien quarter when the explosions began. The hull had been breached, and the emergency doors had failed to seal properly. Atmosphere was venting into space, and the aliens trapped in that section had minutes to live. Cirith had prepared herself for death, certain that the humans would prioritize their own kind and leave the aliens to suffocate instead. She had watched 17 human workers form a living wall against the breach. They had used their own bodies to slow the venting atmosphere, pressing themselves against the gap in the hull, while others worked frantically to evacuate the alien residents one by one. The humans had died. The cold of space had frozen their lungs. Vacuum had burst the blood vessels in their eyes, and still they had held their positions. Held them even as their bodies failed. Held them until the last alien child had been carried to safety. Cirith had been one of the last to be evacuated, and she had been close enough to see the face of the final human standing in the breach. He had been a young maintenance worker, barely out of adolescence by human standards. His skin had been turning blue from oxygen deprivation, and his eyes had been filled with terror, but he had not moved. He had not run. He had stood there and died so that strangers could live. There had been no cameras in that section, no witnesses except the aliens being, save no one to record his sacrifice, and no one to reward his bravery. He had died anonymously, painfully, and completely without recognition, and he had done it anyways. Report to the Concord that week was 3 words long. They weren't. Feigning. Ambassador Kethvorin's response came within hours. He dismissed her findings as the result of psychological contamination and ordered her recalled for immediate evaluation. But as Cirith packed her belongings and prepared to leave Earth, she found herself unable to stop thinking about that young maintenance worker he had been afraid she had seen. The fear in his eyes as clearly as she had ever seen anything, and he had chosen to die anyone, not because he was brave, and not because he was foolish, but because there were people who needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. That was not the behavior of a predator. That was not even the behavior of a rational being. That was something else. Something Cirith had no name for. Something that existed outside the mathematics of survival and self-interest in her final night on Earth. Cirith walked through the streets of the human city where she had been stationed. She watched families laughing together in parks. She saw strangers helping each other carry heavy bags. She observed a human child share her food with a homeless alien who had nothing to offer in return, and for the first time in her life, Sirith allowed herself to consider a possibility that her people had never imagined. Perhaps the universe was wrong. Perhaps violence was not inevitable. Perhaps there was another way to exist among the stars. Perhaps the humans had found. If the Concord would not believe her, they would call her compromised and dismiss everything she had witnessed. But Sirith knew what she had seen, and she knew that the galaxy would eventually have to face the truth. She had discovered the humans were not feigning. They never had been, and that changed everything. The council chambers had never been so quiet. Ambassador Kethboron stood at the central podium, his four hands clasped behind his back as he presented his proposal to the assembled representatives. "We have watched humanity for 3 centuries, he said, his voice echoing through the vast crystal hall. "And we have gathered mountains of evidence suggesting they are exactly what they claim to be." The chamber stirred with uncomfortable murmurs. "But evidence can be manufactured," Kethvarn continued. "Witnesses can be deceived, and even our best observers can be fooled by a sufficiently committed performance." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What we need is a test. A situation where humans believe no one is watching. A moment where they face a clear choice between helping others and serving themselves." The crystalline elder leaned forward, its body pulsing with curious violet light. "What do you propose, Ambassador?" Kethvarn smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "We manufacture a crisis." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The border world of Thiessen IV was home to 300,000 Concord citizens, mostly Vethkai colonists who had settled there centuries ago. The Concord would engineer a catastrophic natural disaster on the planet, something that appeared completely accidental, something that would kill thousands if rescue did not arrive quickly. Then they would ensure their own rescue fleet was delayed. Technical difficulties, navigational errors, bureaucratic complications. The excuses did not matter. What mattered was that humanity would receive the distress signal before any Concord vessel could respond. "When they see the opportunity to let our people die," Kethvarn explained to the council, "when they realize that no one is watching and no one will ever know what they chose to do, their true nature will finally emerge. And if they choose to help," asked a young Moth-Ari delegate, "then we will have our answer," Kethvarn replied. "But they will not help, because no species sacrifices itself for strangers when there is nothing to gain." The council voted to proceed with the test. 3 weeks later, Thiessen IV experienced what appeared to be a massive seismic event. The capital city collapsed into rubble, the atmosphere processors failed, and toxic gases began flooding the lower settlements. Tens of thousands were trapped beneath fallen buildings, and hundreds of thousands more faced slow suffocation as the air turned poisonous. The Concord's rescue fleet, as planned, encountered a series of unfortunate delays. Their fastest ships would not arrive for at least 48 hours. Most of the survivors would be dead by then. The distress signal went out across all channels, and the Concord watched and waited to see what humanity would do. The response was immediate. Within hours of receiving the signal, 12 civilian human vessels had diverted from their planned courses and were racing toward Thiessen IV at maximum speed. The UNSC Hopeful, a medical frigate that had been stationed near the border, burned through its entire emergency fuel reserve to arrive first. Captain James Redhawk of the Hopeful did not wait for authorization from his government. He did not calculate the political implications of his actions. He simply saw people dying and moved to help them. When his crew realized they did not have enough protective equipment to safely enter the radiation zones surrounding the damaged atmosphere processors, Captain Redhawk made a decision that would haunt the Concord for generations. "We go anyway," he said. His officers protested. The radiation would kill them within weeks. There was no cure and no treatment that could save them once they were exposed. Captain Red Hawk listened to their objections and then repeated his order. People are dying right now, and we can save them. And that is what we are going to do. 43 humans died from radiation exposure over the following weeks. 43 humans who knew exactly what they were sacrificing and chose to make that sacrifice anyway. They saved 287,000 Concord citizens. The council watched the reports in stunned silence. It must be political, Kethvorin stammered, his voice cracking for the first time in anyone's memory. They are buying influence with other species. They are trying to earn favor. Their government was furious, the crystalline elder replied quietly. We intercepted their communications, and their leaders did not sanction this rescue. They did not even know about it until it was already happening. Then it was a military decision, a strategic calculation. Captain Red Hawk acted against direct orders from his superiors. The elder continued. He knew he would face court-martial when he returned. And he went anyway. Kethvorin's mouth opened and closed several times. But no words came out. Individual humans simply went, the elder said. They saw people in danger, and they went to help. With no orders and no approval and no expectation of reward. That is impossible, and yet it happened. The chamber fell silent for 6,000 years. The Concord had operated on a single fundamental assumption. Every species was ultimately selfish. Every species would prioritize its own survival over the survival of others. Every species, given the choice between sacrifice and safety, would choose safety. Humanity had just proven that assumption wrong. And if that assumption was wrong, then everything the Concord had built was based on a lie. The Vethkai had destroyed 17 species to prevent future aggression that might never have come. The crystalline hegemony had consumed 3 civilizations that might have become allies instead of threats. The entire structure of galactic politics was built on fear of an enemy that perhaps did not need to exist. Kethvorin left the council chamber without speaking. He walked through the crystal corridors of the Concord headquarters in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed for 300 years. He had been certain that humanity was playing a long game of deception for 300 years. He had watched and waited for the mask to slip. The mask had never slipped because there was no mask. There never had been. Humanity was exactly what they appeared to be, and that changed everything. The truth spread like fire through dry grass, and no amount of suppression could contain it. Within weeks of the Thiessen 4 incident, every species in the Concord had heard the story. The humans had come. The humans had saved them. Humans had died doing it, and they had done it for nothing. No payment had been requested. No political favors had been demanded. No treaties had been offered in exchange. The humans had simply seen people suffering and decided that suffering should end for most species in the galaxy. This revelation was merely surprising for the founding members of the Concord. It was catastrophic. The Vethkai were the first to crack. Their entire civilization had been built on what they called the mathematics of predation, a philosophy that treated violence as an inevitable consequence of evolution. Every species that reached the stars, the mathematics predicted, would eventually turn to conquest. It was not a matter of if, but when. The only rational response was to strike first, to eliminate potential threats before they could become actual threats. The Vethkai had used this philosophy to justify the destruction of 17 emerging civilizations over the Phaeacians. Over the fascinated they past 4,000 years, 17 species erased from existence. 17 cultures reduced to ash and memory. 17 peoples who would never again see their suns rise, all because the mathematics said they would. eventually become dangerous. But if humanity was genuine, if a species could reach the stars and choose cooperation over conquest, then the mathematics was wrong, and if the mathematics was wrong, then those 17 species had not been threats at all. They had been murdered. The realization struck the Vethkai like a physical blow. Elder Kethmoth, the oldest living member of their species, was found weeping in the memorial gardens 3 days after the truth became public. "We killed them for nothing," he said to the young attendant who discovered him. "We killed children who might have grown up to be our friends." The crystalline hegemony faced a similar crisis. Their species existed in a state of perpetual hunger, a biological drive to consume energy from any available source in their early history. They had satisfied this hunger by draining the life force of other species. 3 entire civilizations had been devoured before the old Concord had intervened and taught them to channel their hunger into more acceptable pursuits, but the hegemony had always believed that their hunger made them fundamentally dangerous, that they were predators by nature and could never truly change if humanity could be genuinely good. If a species could overcome its violent instincts through choice rather than force, then perhaps the hegemony had been wrong about themselves all along. Perhaps they had never needed to consume those 3 civilizations. Perhaps there had been another way. Young crystallines began demanding answers from their elders. Why had they never tried to find a different path? Why had they accepted their hunger as destiny instead of challenging it? Why had they let millions die when those deaths might have been avoided? The hegemony cracked from within, fracturing into factions that blamed each other for crimes committed millennia before any of them had been born. Even the peaceful Mothari were not immune to the reckoning. They had built their reputation on gentleness and compassion, but they had also accepted the Concord's fundamental assumptions without question. They had stood by while other species were destroyed. They that offered no objection when the Vethkai proposed preemptive strikes against emerging civilizations. They had been complicit through their silence. Ambassador Kethvorin of the Dominion retreated to his personal chambers and did not emerge for 3 weeks. When he finally reappeared, he looked like he had aged a century. His scales were dull and cracked. His forearms hung limply at his sides. His eyes, once sharp with cunning and calculation, now stared at nothing. He submitted a single sentence: resignation to the council. "I have devoted my life to understanding the universe, and I understand nothing." Cirith was summoned back from her psychological evaluation. The council that had dismissed her findings now begged her to explain what she had witnessed. "You studied them longest," they said, their voices heavy with desperation. "You lived among them and watched them and learned their ways. What do you want me to tell you?" Cirith asked. "Explain this. Explain how a species capable of such violence can choose gentleness. Explain how predators can become protectors. Explain how everything we believed about the universe can be wrong." Cirith stood in silence for a long moment. She had spent months preparing for this question, turning it over in her mind during sleepless nights and endless days of observation. "You are asking the wrong question," she finally said. The council leaned forward. "You assume that gentleness is a choice made despite their nature," Cirith continued. "You believe that humans are predators who have somehow learned restraint. Is that not what they are?" "No," Cirith said. "Humans are not predators who learned restraint. They are prey who learned courage." The council stirred with confusion on their homeworld. "Humans were never the apex predator," Cirith explained. "They were hunted by creatures larger and faster and stronger than themselves. And they survived not through dominance, but through cooperation. They are pack hunters," a Vethkai elder interjected. "We have seen this before. They are something more than that," Cirith replied. Pack hunters cooperate to kill more efficiently. But humans cooperate because cooperation is how they survived. It is woven into their very nature. It is not a strategy but an instinct. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Every act of violence cost them something. She said, I saw it in their faces when they were forced to fight. I saw the pain and the guilt and the shame. Violence wounds them even when it is necessary. And kindness restores them, Sirith said. Kindness is what they return to when the fighting is done. Kindness is their natural state. And violence is the aberration. The council sat in stunned silence for 6,000 years. They had assumed that violence was the natural state of all intelligent species. They had built their entire civilization on that assumption, and they had been wrong. The universe was not what they thought it was, and now they had to figure out what to do about it. 50 years had passed since the truth about humanity had shattered the old order, and the galaxy was almost unrecognizable. The concord of ascending species had dissolved within a decade of the Thesan 4 incident. Its founding principles too corrupted by guilt and shame to survive the light of revelation. In its place rose something new. The alliance of cooperative worlds had been humanity's idea. Of course, they had proposed it quietly, without fanfare or demands, simply offering a framework for species who wanted to work together rather than against each other. The surviving civilizations had embraced it with desperate enthusiasm for the Vethkai. The alliance offered something they had never believed possible: redemption. They could not bring back the 17 species they had destroyed, but they could honor their memory. The great memorial gardens of Vethkai Prime now stretched across an entire continent, with separate sections dedicated to each vanished civilization. Every Vethkai child was brought there on their naming day to learn what their ancestors had done, and to swear they would never repeat those mistakes. The crystalline hegemony had transformed even more dramatically. Their hunger had not disappeared, but they had learned to channel it in ways that helped rather than harmed crystalline engineers, once builders of world-cracking weapons, now constructed massive energy collectors that gathered power from dying stars and distributed it to species in need. They fed their hunger by feeding others, even the former. Warships of the Dominion had found new purpose, the great battle cruisers that had once patrolled the borders looking for threats now served as mobile hospitals, carrying medical teams to disaster zones across the galaxy. Captain Redhawk's sacrifice had inspired an entire generation of humans to join the fleet, and they had brought their strange philosophy of selfless service with them. Sirith watched it all from her position as the Alliance's chief historian. She was ancient now by Vethkai standards, her carapace grown gray and brittle with age. But her mind remained sharp. She had spent the past 50 years compiling the document that would define galactic civilization for millennia to come. She called it the human axiom. Its core principle was simple but revolutionary. The universe assumed violence was inevitable, because violence was all it had ever known. But inevitability was a choice, and humanity had chosen differently. The old mathematics of predation had been replaced by something the human philosophers called the economics of empathy. It turned out that kindness was not a weakness but a strength. Species that cooperated thrived, while species that competed destroyed themselves, the very traits that the Concord had once dismissed as naive idealism were actually the keys to long-term survival. Trust created stability. Generosity created allies. Compassion created bonds that no amount of force could break. The humans had known this instinctively. They had never needed to learn it, because it was written into their very nature. And now, slowly, the rest of the galaxy was learning it too. On the day Sirith finished the human axiom, She received a message from the Alliance Council. They wanted her to present the document at a special ceremony attended by representatives of 40 different species. She was too weak to travel. So they came to her instead, her small quarters on the orbital station above Vethkai Prime were suddenly crowded with beings of every shape and size. Crystalline elders glowed softly in the corners. Mothari delegates hovered near the ceiling. Human ambassadors stood respectfully along the walls. And in the center of it all sat Cirith, her old body propped up by cushions. A voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent 50 years studying humanity," she said, "and I have written everything I learned in this document." She gestured to the data crystal in her attendant's hands. "But I do not think the document contains the most important thing I discovered." The assembled representatives leaned forward. "When I first arrived on Earth," Cirith continued, "I expected to find monsters, creatures of violence and deception, who wore masks of kindness to hide their true nature." She paused, her ancient mandibles clicking slowly. "Instead, I found something far more terrifying to the old Concord." "What was that?" asked a young human ambassador. Cirith looked at her with eyes that had seen centuries of change. "Hope," she said. "I found hope. Hope that the universe did not have to be a dark and violent place. Hope that species could choose to be better than their instincts. Hope that the future could be different from the past." She reached out and took the human's hand in her own. "Your species gave us that hope," she said. "You showed us that we were not prisoners of our nature, that we could choose who we wanted to be. That kindness was not weakness, and compassion was not foolishness." The chamber had fallen completely silent. "The old Concord thought you were feigning," Cirith said. "They thought no species could genuinely be what you appeared to be." She smiled. A Vethkai expression she had learned from watching humans. They were wrong. 3 days later, Cirith died peacefully in her sleep. Her body was cremated according to Vethkai tradition, and her ashes were scattered in the memorial garden she had helped create. But her words lived on in the halls of the Alliance, carved into the memorial stone for every species that had ever feared the dark. Humanity had insisted on a single inscription: "We made it this far together. We will make it the rest of the way the same." And beneath those words, added by unanimous vote of all 40 member species, was a second inscription in memory of Cirith, who came looking for monsters and found friends instead. The galaxy had changed forever, not through conquest or force or intimidation, but through the simple, impossible, revolutionary act of being genuinely kind. The universe had thought humans were feigning. The universe had been wrong, and the universe was better for it.